I will never forget the first youth conference I ever went to. There was a speaker who got up on stage and he began to tell a story. And to this day, over 20 years later, I still remember the story. It was as if it was yesterday. You see, when we tell stories, when we speak to students, we engage them in a way that is unforgettable. My name is Matt Maiberger, and I'm the founder of Youth Speakers Coach. And for a few moments today, I'd like to share with you the 10 commandments of storytelling. Commandment number 1. Thou shalt love the story you are going to tell. There is no use in telling a story if you're not passionate about it, if you don't own it. Storyteller and preacher Tommy Oakes says this. He quotes this old hymn called I Love to Tell the Story. And he says, if you don't love to tell a story, it's not worth telling. In fact, in this old hymn, the words go like this. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old, old story of Jesus and his love. Do you love to tell the stories that you tell when you speak to students? If you don't love to tell it, it's not a story worth telling. The second commandment of storytelling says this. Thou shalt always tell stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's no use in telling a half of a story when you communicate to students. Your stories need to have a beginning, a once upon a time where you set up the time and the place where the story happened. Your stories need to have a middle section of content that is just rich with content for the students. And then, of course, your story has to have an ending. They all lived happily ever after. Every story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The third commandment of storytelling is really the secret sauce of storytelling. In fact, the third commandment of storytelling says this, thou shalt always engage all 5 of the senses when telling a story. In fact, science backs this up and says this. If students simply listen to a PowerPoint presentation with boring bullet points, only a certain part in their brain gets activated. Scientists call this area Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Overall, you're only hitting the language processing parts of their brains where they decode words into meaning, and that's it. Nothing else happens. Except if someone begins to tell you about how delicious certain foods are, then all of a sudden your sensory cortex lights up. If the story is about motion, the motion cortex part of the brain lights up. When you use metaphors like the singer had a velvety voice or he had leathery hands, all of a sudden you begin to rouse that sensory cortex in students, and those sensory portions of their brain become engaged just like they were actually experiencing the story for themselves. Students need story, and they need you to engage them with story. Now, the fourth commandment of storytelling says this. Thou shalt change character voices when telling a story. And here's what that means in a simple way. If you're telling a story to your students about how when you were growing up, your mom used to nag you, and you're having a conversation in that story, then you'll want to change your voice from your voice, hey mom, I'm coming to dinner, to your mom's naggy voice, Matthew, it's time for dinner! make sure that you're always changing character voices. You never know when a good Mickey Mouse impersonation will come into play in helping students engage by changing the character voices of your story. The fifth commandment of storytelling says this: thou shalt always maintain strong eye contact. Eye contact is one of the best things you can use when telling stories to help engage your students and make sure they're connecting to the story that you're telling. In fact, I want to encourage you to use what's called the 5-second rule. And here's how that works. As you're telling a story, whether it's to a group of 10 students or a group of 1,000 students, what you're going to do is you're going to look specifically at one particular student in the room. As you do that, in your brain, while you're telling the story, you silently count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds in your mind while you're telling the story. Then, after that 5 seconds is over, you break eye contact, move your eyes to another student in the room or another section in the room of students, and you choose another student there to make eye contact with, build that connection, make sure that they're looking at you. Remember, eyes are the window to the soul. And so make sure that you use the 5-second rule. The sixth commandment of storytelling says this: thou shalt always rehearse your stories before telling them. Now, as you can see, I'm standing here in our auditorium. It's empty at the moment. There's no one seated here. It's a great environment for me to be able to practice the stories that I'm going to tell to students or rehearse my message before I deliver it. Now, I know. The temptation is throw the message together on Wednesday afternoon, before you give it Wednesday evening. I know the temptation is to throw the message together on Saturday night before you deliver it on Sunday morning. However, I want to challenge you to take to heart this sixth commandment of storytelling. Because if you can take the time to rehearse your stories, you're going to be able to own them. You're going to be able to own the biblical content and stories you're trying to deliver, and you're going to do a much better job in engaging the students when you tell your stories. Seventh commandment of storytelling says this: thou must always think through your story blocking. Now, story blocking is a very, very simple thing. In story blocking, you determine where are you going to stand when you deliver your stories. Probably the worst thing you can do is stand behind a pulpit or stand behind a table or a music stand. If you're going to begin telling stories as you share with students, you want to step out from behind that podium, and you want to be able to engage those students as you tell the story. So think through your stories as far as where you might stand. Now, if you're telling a story that's chronological, for instance, when I was born, you would move over to your right, which would be your student's left, and you're going to begin by telling that story over here. When I was born, and then as you grow up, you move towards the center of the area, the platform that you're delivering the stories from or the message from. Then, as you continue on, you move to your left, telling a blocking timeline of that story. Always think through your story blocking. The eighth commandment of storytelling says this: that thou shalt always move with purpose when you're telling your stories. Similar to commandment number 7 about blocking, you always want to make sure that when you're telling stories to students, that your movement on the platform or on stage or in front of the group, you want to make sure that your movement always has a purpose. Youth pastors and youth speakers alike have this strong temptation to constantly be moving when they tell stories. And they'll almost be pacing back and forth across the stage. I remember the first time I preached a sermon in front of my church. I was 16 years old. And if you go back and watch that video, I am just racing back and forth across the stage constantly. You don't want to move that much. You want to make sure that all of your movements have purpose. Make sure you move with purpose. You also don't want to just completely stand still like a statue, because that's boring to watch. Make sure that your movements have purpose when you tell story. The ninth commandment of storytelling says this: thou shalt always use gestures when telling your story. Now, I have coached many youth pastors in speaking who love to talk with their hands. Now, there's nothing wrong with talking with your hands. I can imagine if I were sitting with you at Starbucks right now and we were having a cup of coffee, you were telling me a story about your weekend, that you might be using all sorts of hand gestures. And that's great, because gestures are a method of nonverbal communication that speak very loudly. I want you to be sure that when you use gestures during your stories, that the gestures you're using are punctuating what you're saying during your story. Speaking coach Patricia Fripp says this, that everything we do either adds to or distracts from our message. That means whatever it is you do with your hands while you tell stories is either adding to the story or taking away from the story. You want to make sure that your gestures are adding. So if you're talking about how tall something is, you're using gestures to explain that. Or you're explaining how tiny something is, you're using gestures to convey that meaning. The final commandment in the 10 commandments of storytelling is, thou shalt always texturize your story with vocal tonality. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm sitting right here at a keyboard, and as you know, in music, you can play high notes, you can play low notes, you can play loud notes, you can play quiet notes. And when we do that, when we speak, we actually use our voice as an instrument to communicate different kinds of emotion. So for instance, if you were talking very quickly and very fast, that would communicate excitement. But if you were to just whisper or talk quietly, you're going to draw the students in to what you're trying to say and the story that you're telling. So it's important to be sure you know what you're doing with your voice while you're telling your stories. In fact, I want to challenge you to do one thing. If you want to improve your vocal tonality when you tell stories, I always encourage youth pastors to try to use their opposite voice when they're trying to make a point. For instance, if you tend to be a very loud, excited talker in general, then to add emphasis, you're going to quiet your voice almost to a whisper. And you're going to talk slowly. However, if you're typically pretty much a type B kind of a voice that's very laid back, very conversational, you might tend to get very loud, and that's okay. It'll all of a sudden grab the student's attention.